Hi folks, and welcome back to the Advantage Applications channel. My name is Rich, and in my last video I showed you guys how to automate Outlook from Access to send an automatic email to a group of predefined users whenever a certain event occurs within that database. In this video I'm going to show you a much easier way to do that using Power Automate. The only caveat is that your backend needs to be in SharePoint instead of Access. And if you've watched my previous videos, you know that that's my preferred way to use Access in the modern work environment because it just opens you up to be able to use so many more tools that are available on the Power Platform. Before we do that, I want to remind you, if you become a member of my channel, you'll have access to all of the source code and files that I use in these videos to study on your own or even to incorporate them into your own projects. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'll show you how to automate email from Power Automate using your Access database. You may recall from the last video that we used a simple event reporting application where a user can provide information about an event that occurred, and once they click Submit, the application automatically generates an email to predefined recipients. It accomplishes this by automating the desktop version of Microsoft Outlook using VBA code. And to be honest, if this were a real-world implementation of this application, the email wouldn't be plain text. It would be HTML to give more formatting and style. So your code would actually look something more like this code snippet from a more complex version of this app in use for one of my clients. So although it isn't difficult, it does require time to code, test, and debug, as well as Outlook installed on each user's workstation. But by using SharePoint as a backend for our data, as I recommended in my video on how Access is best used in the modern office environment, we have access to powerful low-code tools like Power Automate. And that's what we're going to use to accomplish sending an email when an event is created now. So the first thing I'm going to do is to create a new table that will store the information I want to include in the email that will be sent whenever a new event is submitted. I'll create a generic ID field of type auto number and make it the primary key. Next, I'll add a field for event date, then one to hold the originator of the event. And I'll just resize these windows so I can see the fields of the form. Okay, so now I need a field for event location and one for event type. And then finally one for event description. And I'll make this one a long text data type because users may provide a lengthy description of the event. And I'll save this table as TBL email info. Actually, I need one more very important field, the email recipients. Now I'm going to export this local table to SharePoint and then relink to it. I'll go over the steps quickly here, but if you want a more in-depth explanation of how to do this, check out my video on using SharePoint as a backend for Access databases. I'll link to it in the description. First, I'll right-click on my table, then go to Export, and then select SharePoint List. Once the export dialog box comes up, just make sure that the SharePoint site you want to use is selected or entered manually into the text box. You can confirm that the table being exported is the one you want. And you can have the exported list open when it's finished, but I really don't need to do that right now, so I'm just going to go ahead and uncheck this box. Now I'll just click OK, and the table is exported to SharePoint as a list. My next step is to delete the local table so I can link to it on SharePoint. Now I go up to External Data, then select Online Services, then select SharePoint List. A dialog box will appear, and again you want to make sure the correct SharePoint site is selected and that link to the data source is selected and not Import. Now I click Next, and I'm presented with all of the available lists on the SharePoint site. The lists that are already linked to in this database will have checked boxes beside them. And we can see right here is our new TBL email info list. I'll check its box and then click OK. And now we see it in our linked table list. Okay, with our new SharePoint list linked, we're ready to add some code to the Submit button. I'm going to come down to the line of code that called the subroutine that handled automating Outlook and comment it out, since we don't need that anymore. And I'm going to come just above that line and make a call to a subroutine that will write data to our new table. I'll call it write data to TBL email info. Okay, now let's go create that subroutine. The first thing I'll do is dimension a string variable to hold my SQL statement. And we're going to be inserting into TBL email info. And when it comes to the list of fields we'll be populating, I like to just view my table in Design View and copy the field names into my code so I don't make any typos. When I try to view this table in Design View, I'll get a prompt letting me know that the design of this table can't be changed because it's linked. That's no problem. There we go, and you'll notice there are some new fields in the table that we didn't explicitly create. SharePoint does this whenever you migrate a table from Access, but it's not a problem either, and we're only concerned with the fields that we created. So the first one I want is event date. I just copy that and paste it into my code. And if you aren't familiar with using SQL statements in VBA code, be sure to check out my video on how to execute SQL from VBA. I'll put the link to that video in the description also. Okay, the next field I want is originator. So I'll just copy that name and paste it in my code next. And I'm going to do this for each of the fields that we explicitly created in this table. Now we need to specify the values that will go into these fields. The first value we need is for event date. And since it's a date value, we'll need to enclose it in hash marks. And since the form will still be in memory, we can reference the form controls to get our values. So for event date, I'll just copy the control name and paste it into my code. Okay, the next field we want to provide a value for is originator. And since it's a short text data type, we'll need to enclose it in single quotes. The VBA code for a single quote is CHR or char 39. Again, I'll go to the form, copy the control name right from there, and paste it into the code. The next field we're providing a value for is just a bit different. It's still a short text data type, so we'll need to enclose it in single quotes. But you can see here on the form, it's not a text box, it's a combo box. If we look at the data behind the combo box, we see we have two fields. The ID field, which is the stored value, and the location field, which is the display value, and the one we want to write to our table. So I'll go ahead and copy the control name and paste it into my code, but I'm going to reference the second column of that control, which has an index of 1. Now that may seem a little confusing since the second column is the one I said I want, but combo box columns are 0-based index. So the first column is column 0, the second column is column 1, and so on. The next field we want to provide a value for is event type. And since the form control we're going to reference is a list box, it'll be very similar to the way we dealt with the combo box. We'll go to the Data tab again and check the control's row source property. And again, we see the stored value as a numeric ID, and the display value, which is the one we want, is in the second column again. So again, I copy the control name, paste it into my code, and reference the second column, which again is index 1. Okay, the next field value is easy. It's a simple text value. And I'll just be referencing the control name on the form. The last field we need to provide a value for is email recipients, and it just so happens we already have a function to get those recipients that we built in the last video when we automated Outlook from Access. And this function simply opens TBL email recipients and cycles through each record in the table, putting the addresses into an output variable. Then it returns that output to the calling code. So all we have to do to get those recipients is to call the function name. All right, we're ready to run the code. I like to enclose my insert statements with code that turns the warnings off and then back on. That way the users don't get tired of seeing warning messages. Okay, I'll put a stop in the code here so we can step through it and make sure everything works correctly. And just to remind you, our new subroutine will be called from this line in the click event of the submit button. All right, I'll say that this event occurred on the loading docks, and we'll say someone fell off of a fork truck. We'll call it unsafe behavior and click submit. After a bit, our code break is reached and we can start stepping through the code. We start our insert statement. It references the controls to populate the fields with values. And then we get to our custom function, which steps through each record and table email recipients, concatenating email addresses as it goes, and then it returns it back to our calling code. I want to skip over the code that silences warnings while we're debugging. And sure enough, we have a syntax error. No problem, let's view our SQL statement in the immediate window. Oh wow, insert. Okay, let me spell insert correctly. I'll drag the code playhead back up to the beginning of the SQL statement, clear the error, play through the code once more. And this time it looks like it's going to work. Now we can go to our new table, and there's the data we just wrote to it. Now we just need to make it so that whenever a new record is written to this table, an email is automatically sent to the recipients. So here I am at my SharePoint site, and I haven't done anything with this to customize it because currently it's just used for data storage. If I click the gear icon in the upper right of the screen, I can then select Site Contents, and here we see the lists I'm using as tables, including the new TBL email info list. And if I click on it, we see the record we entered. To make it so that an email is automatically sent when a record's created in this table, I'll use Power Automate to create a flow. And if you're unfamiliar with those terms, don't sweat it, just follow along and you'll be fine. There are several ways to create a flow, but since we're already in the table, I can simply come up to the Integrate icon, hover over Power Automate, and select Create a Flow. A list of templates for common flow tasks will appear, and the one we want is right at the top. Send a customized email when a new SharePoint list item is added. So I click that, and we're ready to start building our flow. When I scroll down the page, we see that this flow will use connections to SharePoint, Office 365 users, and Office 365 Outlook. And we see to the right of those connections the account name that I'm logged in with, and a green check beside each one, indicating that I have the correct permissions. If you don't have the correct permissions, you may have to contact Microsoft support to get what you need. Okay, I click Create Flow, and it thinks for a bit, then I'm presented with a message that lets me know that my flow is created and ready for use. After I click Got It, I'm presented with a form that gives me some details about my flow, like flow name, description, and primary owner. Also, there's a 28-day run history, connections, co-owners, and I can edit this to add new co-owners if I like, and any associated apps and flows. To make sure the email sends useful info about the event that we submitted, I want to come up to the top and click Edit. I'm presented with a workspace that lists each of the connections used in this flow. The trigger is correct. We want this flow to run whenever a new item is created, so I don't need to edit this at all. The next step, where my account information is used to run this flow, is also correct, so I won't need to edit anything here either. But I do want to customize the email, so I'll click it. A preview of the email opens, and you'll see color-coded elements that represent dynamic content that will be placed into the email when it's generated. First, in the To section of the email, it'll use the profile connector to get my email address. The subject is pre-populated with some generic text, and the email body used the profile connector again to get my given name. Then two functions are used to get the time the record was entered and by whom. And finally, the SharePoint connector is used to get the contents of the title field of the newly inserted record. So before we actually edit this to contain more useful info, let's see what it looks like as is. I'm going to come back into the Access front end and submit another event. This time I'll select Production Floor, and I'll say that someone hit their hand with a hammer, and we'll call it an unsafe behavior. Okay, now if we come back to our SharePoint list, TBL info, we see our new record. And if we go back to our flow details, we see our run succeeded. And finally, if we go to Outlook, we see that we did receive an email letting us know that a new item has been created with the generic info that we saw in the email template. And if this is all you need, just a basic heads up to let people know that a record's been created, then you can stop here. It's that easy. But if you want to include more details in the email, we can use those dynamic content elements to do just that. So let's go back to our flow and click on the Send Email element. The first thing we want to do in this example is to make it so the email is sent to the people we listed in the email recipients field and not just to ourselves. So I'll click in the To section of the email template again, and there are two icons that show up to the right of the text field, a lightning bolt and a function symbol. I'm going to click the function symbol. A new slide-out window appears with the text field at the top where I can begin typing a function. Just below that are the words function and dynamic content. We're going to click dynamic content. Now below, I can see the data elements I can choose from the connections in this flow. At the top are the data elements for my profile connector, and below that are the elements for the SharePoint connection, aka the newly created record. All I need to do is scroll down to the field I want, which in this case is the email recipients field, and select it, then click Add. The new dynamic content node shows up in the To section of the email template now. I could remove myself from the email, but I'm going to leave it in for right now. Next, I'll update the subject line to be a bit more informative. I'll say an event has been submitted for, and here I'll use another bit of dynamic content, the event location field from the newly inserted record. Then I just click Add again, and it shows up in my subject line. I'll use the same method to also include the ID field of the event. Okay, now I'm ready to modify the email body. I'll get rid of the profile element here and replace it with a standard greeting that I want to send anytime an email is sent. Next, I'll get rid of the other parts of the email body I don't want. Then I'll include the details of the event. And I'll use exactly the same method to get data from the fields in the newly inserted record as I did for the subject line. First, I'll add ID. Next, I'll add when the event occurred. And I'll do exactly the same for originator, event location, and event type. Next, I'll put a generic closing statement here that lets the users know that this is an automated email and they can contact me for support. All right, that looks good. And in the last video, I mentioned having to use VBA code to write HTML and CSS to add styling to your email text. But by using Power Automate, I can format my template by using controls right here at the top of the builder. That saves a lot of time coding, testing, and debugging. And it's a big advantage of having SharePoint as the back end and using Power Automate to send emails. Okay, now I'll come over here to the upper right of the screen and click Save. After a few seconds, I get a message near the top of the screen letting me know that my flow is saved and ready to go. Excellent. Now let's give it a try. I'll go back over to my Access front end, and this time I'll put in an event that occurred in the offices. We'll say someone tripped on an extension cord, and I'll call it a health and safety event. Okay, now let's look at our SharePoint list. I'll refresh the page, and there's our newly inserted record. I changed the email recipients in the database to addresses that I own. I didn't want to send anyone a random email. So now let's see if it worked. I'll go back to Outlook, and we can see the new email has arrived with the custom subject line. Previewing the email, we see that the dynamic content was brought in correctly as well. If this was a real-world application, I would format the date time to something more typical, and I'd correct this spacing issue here. But all in all, it isn't bad. I'm going to look at one of my Gmail accounts as well, and the email has come to this address as well. So that's it. I hope you found this video useful, and if you like this kind of content, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and take care.